Good evening, everyone, and welcome to ClearCut. I'm Michelle Makori. The Trump administration has slapped new sanctions on Iranian officials and companies. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin explaining the details this morning. The sanctions focus on Iran's steel industry and the Iranian leaders who crack down on domestic dissent.
We're striking at the heart of the Islamic Republic's inner security apparatus. These sanctions targets include the Secretary of the Supreme National Council and the commander of the Basij forces. That's the regime's brute squad, which has in the last few months killed approximately 1,500 Iranians who were simply demanding freedom.
But the sanctions announcement quickly turned into a grilling from the news media about the justification for the U.S. decision last week to take out Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, the leader of Iran's terrorist Quds Force. Secretary Pompeo reaffirmed that the move thwarted an attack on U.S. interests and clarified what the administration meant by the imminent threat posed by Soleimani.
We had specific information on an imminent threat, and those threat stream included attacks on U.S. embassies. Period. Full stop.
So you were mistaken when you said you didn't know precisely when and you didn't know precisely where?
Nope. Completely true. Those are completely consistent thoughts. I don't know exactly which minute. We don't know exactly which day it would have been executed, but it was very clear. Qasem Soleimani himself was plotting a broad, large-scale attack against American interests, and those attacks were imminent.
Against an embassy?
Against American facilities, including American embassies, military bases, American facilities throughout the region.
But the sparring between Pompeo and the news media continued as some reporters questioned why President Trump trusted the intelligence reports on Soleimani.
Why then should Americans suddenly believe your assertions that you had good intelligence on this when the head of the executive branch has been casting aspersions on the intelligence community for most of his time in office?
Look, I served as the CIA director for the first year and a half of this administration. I watched the president rely on the work that the intelligence community did for the entire time I served as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. I watched him rely on the capable men and women who are delivering exquisite information to the executive branch. I watched the president have confidence in that information. We all challenge their work. We have to make sure we get it right. The intelligence community is not flawless. We get it wrong. In this case, the intelligence community got it fundamentally right. Even the reflections we've seen after the after this strike that Qasem Soleimani took has demonstrated that we were quite right. There was an imminent attack, there was active plotting, and we took an action that we thought was likely to create less risk for the American people, and I'm confident that we did that.
Meanwhile, another big question is whether the past week's event will coax European nations to back away from their support of Iran. But so far, the EU is still going the other way, holding an emergency summit in Brussels today to discuss efforts to preserve the controversial Iran nuclear deal. Members of an opposition Iranian group demonstrated outside that summit today. Let's bring in tonight's opening panel for perspective and analysis. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Matt Brodsky, a senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. Thank you both for being with us. Behnam, the U.S. is authorizing these new sanctions against the Iranian metal industry as well as senior regime officials. What impact do you see these sanctions having?
Good evening, Michelle. Good evening, Matt. Not just those industries, but against 4 other major sectors of the Iranian economy, to include the construction sector, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry when taken in the aggregate with all the others. So these will have a major macroeconomic effect. Basically, it's going to affect the larger economy of Iran when compounded with the existing sanctions that have been on the books. If you look at what Washington's done pretty skillfully and already in record time, it's been financial sanctions, oil sanctions, and sectors and banks and businesses associated with those industries. Now Washington is replicating this pain on the non-oil sector, basically going after multiple sources of Iran's export revenue, driving down the money that they have in an already tough time, forcing them to make even tougher budgetary choices and in less time. So I think if enforced properly, these sanctions stand to do record damage.
Well, the enforcement may be an issue. And Matt, even with the regime firing missiles at the U.S. and taking down a Ukrainian jet, as the evidence is suggesting so far, even with the regime killing demonstrators, the EU still wants to save this deal. Now, as long as Europe and other countries help Iran skirt the sanctions and try to save this flawed deal, can the diplomatic solution yield results? Can the maximum pressure campaign to bring Tehran back to the negotiating table work if Tehran keeps on getting outs from the other countries?
Well, first of all, the approach of the administration with the maximum pressure has actually had a tremendous effect. It explains a lot of their behavior, and the sanctions that were just described very well are frankly going to cause even a greater bite. So whether Europe wants to play ball or not, the U.S. has enough at its disposal to keep on turning up the pressure. Whether they're going to come to the table, Iran's going to come to the table and talk, remains to be seen. What we do know is that the latest conversations I've had with senior officials is they're a little bit more hopeful than usual that the discussions that they've been having with Europe will lead them toward finally putting the final nail in the coffin of the JCPOA. This is, of course, to trigger the dispute mechanism. A technical process then follows, 65 days, basically. But it's something that could happen. We'll have to see. But it's clearly the main point of what President Trump's policy has been, is to achieve as much pressure through economic means.
Doesn't help when his allies continue to push against him. Behnam, the president was saying today that Iran was planning attacks against 4 U.S. embassies. He made those comments to Fox News. We heard that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, getting a lot of pushback from the media about the need to take out Soleimani, about the nature of the imminent threat. How imminent is imminent? Does that really matter, Behnam?
That's a great question, Michelle, but I think all of that is missing the forest of the trees. Soleimani has baited and bleeded Americans as well as countless members of armies of coalition forces throughout the region. He's principally responsible for the surge in forces to defend and support the Assad regime. That was at one point the embattled Assad regime in Syria, responsible for that refugee crisis. Countless people across the regions, Muslims really, are celebrating the death of Soleimani, the passing of this figure who's really had a chokehold on the heartland of the Middle East to import Iran's revolutionary foreign policy into that region. So yes, in some ways, the comments and questions and pushback does, of course, miss the forest through the trees. Obviously, it's good to have a much more robust discussion about the timing. What are the propitious conditions that different activities can be carried out? What effect does this have for American foreign policy towards Iraq, if any? Those are always very valid questions. But the nature and the tone and the tenor of the pushback on the need to go after Soleimani, I think, is not proper, is not looking at the issue with the proper context. And that proper context is Soleimani's 20-plus year history at the helm of a designated terror group, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force.
The need to go after the mastermind of Iran's terrorist activities over the past 30 years or so. Ben and Matt, stick around, a lot more to discuss. We also want to get your thoughts on the new developments in the Ukrainian airline disaster in Tehran. Iran is now denying that it shot the jet down, and it's getting support from a key ally. Plus, experts believe that Israel is behind an overnight attack on Iranian militia fighters and bases at the Iraqi-Syrian border. And Nancy Pelosi has finally revealed when she's going to turn over the Arctic. This is ClearCut coming to you live from New York City. Welcome back. I'm Michelle Makori. The other major story tonight out of Iran is the continuing search for answers after the Ukrainian passenger jet burst into flames and crashed in Tehran on Wednesday morning. Experts in the U.S. and several other nations believe that Iran shot the jetliner down, but Iran is denying that. Correspondent Trevor Ault has more.
Today, Iran is denying this video shows the moment of impact, a ground-based missile hitting a 737. Take Taken from a neighborhood where the Ukrainian jet was last tracked, the video appears to confirm what a U.S. source tells ABC News. Intelligence sources are confident an Iranian anti-aircraft missile hit that jetliner. And this video captured in a Tehran neighborhood showing the crippled jet up in flames, breaking apart and exploding 3 miles away. The ground impact then captured by a CCTV camera and shown on Iranian media.
The evidence indicates that the plane was shot down by an Iranian surface-to-air missile.
With all 176 passengers and crew on board killed, world leaders continue to state Iran was likely responsible, even though the downing of the jet may not have been intentional. The American intelligence community believes Iran turned on and aimed a radar at the jetliner, a radar signal to guide anti-aircraft missiles from a mobile launcher. A U.S. satellite saw the firing of 2 missiles at the 737. The warheads of those missiles would explode near the aircraft, spraying shrapnel, which would pierce the aircraft in multiple locations. But Iran remains defiant. This morning, Iranian investigators showing off the black boxes they've recovered, but the data still hasn't been pulled from either one. And in this exclusive video obtained by ABC News, the debris field has already been cleared, and with it, any possible evidence gone.
Think of it like a crime scene. You're contaminating the crime scene. You're not able to piece together what actually happened based on what remains.
Iran has now invited some Western countries to get involved in this investigation, including the United States. But the NTSB will need approval from the Trump administration because of these ongoing sanctions against Iran.
That was Trevor Holt reporting. Let's bring back our panel, Behnam Ben Taleblu and Matt Brodsky. Matt, as you see there, Iran has literally been destroying evidence, sending bulldozers to the crash site before Ukrainian investigators arrived. It's not clear to what degree Iran plans to cooperate with the investigation in terms of handing over the black boxes. And the evidence is pretty damning that it was indeed a missile that took down that Ukrainian plane. So the big question, Matt, are there finally going to be some kind of diplomatic consequences for Iran over this?
We'll see. Like I've always said, leave it up to Europe to always do something that is incredibly too small. But the fact is, when you look at what Iran is doing by bulldozing the site, this is something that they've done with their nuclear and military installations. They've gotten quite good at trying to scrub places clean. And yet, when it comes to nuclear activity, evidence is still found there. Another thing that I think it really shows us is with the United States, the way our media and some of our politicians on the left side of the political aisle have behaved is really something that I've never witnessed before. There have been talking points trying to claim that the jet, if it was shot down in a crossfire. For a crossfire, there has to be actually two sides firing. This is 2 days later, Iran fired at the United States and at Iraq. And then they themselves apparently brought down the jet. This is what it is like when you have a rogue regime at the helm.
Yeah, that notion of crossfire as the reason for this is really absurd, Behnam. You do know that, of course, the highest number of citizens on board were Canadian. 63 Canadians are dead. What do you expect from Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau, Behnam?
I'm still not sure. We saw a statement that was rather tepid, but also did confirm that there was a Iranian missile involved, a surface-to-air missile. I think the issue is not going to lie with Canada, but can Washington cobble together some kind of a multilateral coalition to reprimand Iran for impeding the investigation by first saying that black boxes wouldn't be given, then later on saying no investigation, then later on being open to an investigation, then contaminating the site before the foreign investigators arrived.
Behnam,
to
not
kind of establish the facts of the case.
Bulldozing. They've literally sent bulldozers to the crash site. It's not it's not a subtle contamination, Behnam.
Yeah, bulldozing, dispensing with whichever term you like. I'm not familiar with the process by which wreckage is cleaned up versus covered. I assume a bulldozer is involved at some point. But the problem is that the behavior of the Islamic Republic, like Matt said, it's consistent with how it's hided its illicit nuclear and military infrastructure before. But this is the fog of war. And Matt was getting at some of the reporting that's been going on. Yes, when you have two adversaries in sustained contact and sustained high level of hostilities, these things happen. And that's why the Trump Trump administration's move to de-escalate was responsible, was pragmatic. But that's why when you have men who are revolutionaries at the helm, as you do in Iran, these things will happen and will continue to happen. And it's a lesson at what it's like to be led by a rogue regime.
Yeah, as Pompeo said, he just wants Iran to behave like a normal country. It's interesting, Matt, that you've got the Russians coming out and saying that Moscow currently sees no grounds to blame Iran for this Ukrainian airliner crash. What do you make of that?
Well, I make of that they blamed Israel for an airplane that was Russian that was shot down by Assad's own forces over the Mediterranean. I think several months ago. So what Russia says to me is not very important insofar as it relating to the truth. But, you know, this is whatever. They're friends very much with Iran and try to use them.
Matt, before this latest round, there was some momentum with regards to growing anti-government sentiment and protests. The regime was killing demonstrators. There were shoot-to-kill orders. There were reports that the Soleimani killing galvanized the people of Iran and brought some of them together, that it took some of the momentum away from the anti-regime movements. Matt, do you think that was the case?
I don't think that's the case. I've not seen any indication of that. In fact, there are hashtags that have been trending. A lot of Iranians are extremely happy. When people try to represent the regime as representing the people, it gets kind of gross. And that's what we've been seeing more in Western and mainstream media here, which is very, very unfortunate. It's the same as the crossfire type of narrative that with the airliner, and the same thing with Soleimani's death. We seem to be promoting the regime far more than the people, and that is incredibly unfortunate.
Behnam, you got 30 seconds. I want to give you the final word here.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Matt here. This is what it's like to be led by a rogue regime, and I think it's important for everyone, analysts, journalists, think tankers, government officials, to really study the causality of this crisis. Why did Iran fire? What kind of hysterics did it think was about to happen? Obviously, they had just fired ballistic missiles for the first time since the end of the Iran-Iraq War at a state, and they knew what they had done was dangerous. That's why they had braced, and in my view, this is the most likely theory of the case, went hysteric and fired a plane that carried more of their own citizens, because some of those Canadians were Iranian Canadians by birth. So Iran has killed Iranians on land, and now it's moved to killing them in the air.
Yeah. Behnam, thank you so much. Behnam Ben Taleblu, Matt Brodsky. Appreciate your perspective and analysis. Meanwhile, the fight against Iran's proxy armies in the Middle East continued last night. Several